It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this campus for this very important event tonight. I like to think that this is a campus that is enmeshed, and an institution which is enmeshed in our community, and this kind of event serves to underscore that enmeshment. I just realized I got myself into a problem there. There is no such word. I was leading up to enmeshment. We are an urban campus. Our buildings are intermingled with downtown Monterey buildings. I like to think that in both figurative and literal terms, our doors are open to debate and discussion and learning from and teaching members of the community. And so this is a very important kind of event. And every time I say that our doors are open to the community, later I get a text from security saying, our doors are not open. We're not stupid, so they're usually at nighttime, they're locked, but in a figurative sense, the doors are open, and I hope that we'll see evidence of that tonight in the debate and discussion. I want to acknowledge a very important group of people who are here and important to our mission, all of the teachers and students. If you recognize yourself in either or both of those categories, could you raise your hand, please, teachers and students? Fantastic. That's fantastic. We have a number of local community leaders who have honored us with our presence here tonight. I'm going to get to one of them at the end of my short remarks, but I also want to recognize Timothy Barrett of the City Council of Monterey, who is here. Thank you, Timothy, for being here and being a good partner to the Middlebury Institute. Willard Llewellyn, who is the president of Hartnell College, is also here. Delighted. Steve Webster, an aquarium founder and a crowd favorite, a founder of one of our partner organizations, the Citizens Climate Lobby Monterey, is here tonight as well. Thanks to the Citizens Climate Lobby for their partnership in launching this event, to the Center for the Blue Economy, right here on our Middlebury Institute campus, and importantly, the Hayward Sustainability Speaker Series, of which this event is a part. I want to acknowledge that if you're suspicious of the people up in the booths looking down at you, one of the other, in addition to grappling with the world's intractable problems like climate change, like environmental issues, the things that we'll be talking about today, one of the other areas of excellence of this institution is training the next generation of leaders in translation and interpretation, and we take advantage of opportunities like this for our conference interpretation students to practice their interpretation skills up in the booth. So if you hear someone behind you speaking Russian behind the glass, you say, this can't be good. No, it's an academic exercise, and so good work, students, and thanks for participating tonight as well. Now, a little bit of the logistics of tonight's program. Throughout the evening, you'll be able to submit questions to the speaker via text or handwritten card. Text, really? You're just going to be checking for text. Okay. Stop sending. No. I just thought it sounds. But I don't want you to keep texting him after the event is over. Like that. I have one more thought that I wanted to pursue. So, and if you prefer, you can do it by handwritten cards. There are instructions on the inside of your program about the submission of questions. You will need to use your phone. If you're going to do the texting, please have your telephones in silent mode. Handwritten questions will be collected at 6:30. Now, it is my main, in addition to welcoming you to the open-doored campus, again, metaphorically speaking, the other great pleasure of my responsibilities tonight are to introduce remarkable friend of the Middlebury Institute. He's right here in front of me. Good. I said, he didn't leave, did he? And a remarkable friend of Monterey in many different ways. Mayor Clyde Roberson has distinguished himself in many ways, but I think there are two roles that he's played almost throughout his professional career that are emblematic of the virtues that we try to instill in our students here. If you ask people what they know about the mayor, they're likely to say one of two things. He's a lifelong teacher. He's been a teacher in Monterey for decades and serving the community in that way. And he has served in city government, on city council, 3 terms as mayor. Okay, that's correct, 3 terms as mayor. In his leadership at the city level, the driving force behind many things that many of you know a lot, and you may not know that we have Mayor Roberson to thank for them. The Monterey Sports Center. You like the Monterey Sports Center? That was a remarkable asset in the community for which Mayor Roberson is largely responsible. The Neighborhood Improvement Plan. Window on the Bay, where I saw a lot of you in the weeks after the election in November frequently. I don't know, there seemed to be a lot of people gathering down there, is one of the many, many initiatives for which we are thankful to Mayor Clyde Roberson. So without further ado, welcome once again, and please join me in welcoming Mayor Clyde Roberson to tonight's event.
Thank you, Jeff. Look at this full room. That's so exciting. What a pleasure to be here with so many caring people who care about our future, our legacy, our kids. As I had the pleasure of teaching in Monterey Elementary School for 35 years, and I've continued to volunteer over the last 15. Now, don't anybody start doing the math about how old I am. And I can tell you that the young people get it. They understand the challenges facing us. I'm really happy to see some students from Middlebury, CSUMB, et cetera. I have a granddaughter who wants to be a marine scientist, and I'm so grateful that she doesn't have to leave the area. She can do it right here. And that's very exciting for me. In fact, the young people are so dedicated. We were at a Boy Scout event for her little brother, and they had plastic forks, and she refused to use it, so she ate her tostada with her fingers. Now that's dedication. This is my 3rd opportunity to attend a Citizens Climate Lobby event, and after talking to Linda and Maribel, I said, why am I not a member? So I joined. When I was looking at the title, "The Sky is Not Falling, but the Seas Are Rising," after the last 2 weeks, I'm not sure the sky isn't falling. I'm sure if we went to the Florida Keys and the Bahamas and Turks Island and Houston, they might say the sky is falling. So I want to really thank the Citizens Climate Lobby, Middlebury, the Blue Economy for putting this together. And it's going to be a real pleasure for me to talk about Dr. Kelly. We had an opportunity to speak at my office, and he's just very warm. I understood what he was talking about, so you're going to be okay. If I understood what he was saying, he can put it in words that you understand. Just let me quickly tell you about the City of Monterey, Timothy Barrett, our council members here. We really are serious about climate. If you live in the City of Monterey and you want to put solar panels on your house or you want to recycle water, there are 0 costs. You don't have to pay for permits. We want you to do it. So the city government, 85% of the energy that is used by our city government is sustainable, renewable, 85%. We have our first electric trolley, you've seen it, and so we're on that cutting edge as well. We banned plastic bags a long time ago, styrofoam years ago. I got a lot of letters from the oil companies, big surprise, right? Polystyrene and smoking. We oppose sand mining on our coast. Marina led the charge, and CEMEX is going to be going. That is just awesome. We're a member of the Monterey Bay Community Power for Renewable Energy. We're a member of the Monterey Bay Regional Climate Action Compact, and also a member of Mayors for 100% Clean Energy by 2040. So a lot of other things the city's doing, but I want to let you know we really are a city committed to climate. Now, you have a biography of Dr. Kelly in your brochure, but I just enjoyed it so much because, frankly, I was a little envious. He's just gotten back from the Arctic. He's going to talk to you about it. And can we all go next time? He said, sure. How much does it cost? So Dr. Kelly is a marine ecologist with a focus on sea ice environments. And he has gone to the North Pacific Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, the Sea of Okhotsk, the Baltic Sea, and Antarctica. That's just really exciting. It's exciting, but in a way, I'm sure you're going to share, it's a little startling too, right? So it's a two-edged sword. And he's now, we're thinking, looking like he's going to be staying in Monterey with his wife, and we're really delighted about that. So he has a degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He came home. The University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and they kept him for a lot of years up there. Purdue University, and he's been on their faculty. And this is what I just really love as well. He's been on the faculty of the University of Alaska, a research scientist with NOAA, and we're just celebrating the 25th anniversary of our marine sanctuary this year. Isn't that wonderful? Deputy Director of Arctic Sciences at the National House Office of Science and Technology, and currently right here as a senior fellow at the Center for the Blue Economy at Middlebury. So we're just so happy he's here. He lives in Monterey. So Dr. Kelly, we're so happy you're here. And I'm sure he's going to challenge us, but when we talked, he said he always leaves us with hope. So as someone with 5 grandchildren, they're committed. We have hope for the future. Working together, we can solve these problems. This room right here can solve these problems. Dr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mayor Robertson. Tonight, I actually want to share a story that I think will be of particular interest to you as a mayor and as a former teacher. And the story concerns some young students that I met on this recent expedition in the Arctic. It was a trip sponsored by the Students on Ice Foundation. But before I get to that, I'm hoping you'll indulge a story from my boyhood. When I was a little boy, my brothers and I used to like to sleep outdoors in the summertime. And as we lay in our sleeping bags, looking up at the stars, they explained to me how things worked, you know, like why we don't fall off the planet and about the atmosphere and outer space, cool stuff like that. But they also described the possibility that the Russians would, without warning, send a nuclear missile and kill us all. I asserted that I would run really quickly to safety, but they explained that that would be futile. Oops, I just lost my screen there, excuse me. So the point of all that was that I grew up learning about things marvelous and things terrifying. And marveling, it seems to me, is something we do with our minds, and fearing is something we do with our hearts. But let's fast forward from my childhood to a few weeks ago when I stood in Greenland between an ice-choked fjord and 120 students. The ice had calved off of Jakobshavn Glacier, and the students had come from 17 nations. They joined me and 80 instructors and staff on a ship-based expedition across the Arctic. So there I stood explaining the role of Greenland's ice sheet in our changing climate, something for the students' minds. But over the course of the expedition, they more than repaid me with responses from their hearts. So what did I tell them? Well, I told them some of what I had learned in 40 years studying the Arctic, including many lessons learned from indigenous hunters with whom I traveled in walrus skin boats and research vessels. One such hunter was Konrad Oziva, a native hunter from the northern Bering Sea. Now, typically I would see Konrad in a parka and a Wolverine ruff, but here he is on the right in Coast Guard issued survival gear as we were about to board a survey helicopter. And this would have been about 1977, when the icebreaker Polar Sea and I were considerably younger. Well, on that voyage, Konrad shared dozens of Yupik terms for sea ice. And I recently looked at my notebook from that period and realized, somewhat to my horror, that some of those terms refer to types of sea ice that are rare or non-existent today. So that some of those Yupik terms, probably in use for thousands of years, would be obsolete in just a few generations, few decades rather, attest to the rapid pace of change in the Arctic. It attests to the depth of Yupik knowledge, and it attests to the impacts of climate change on indigenous people. Yupik knowledge is the accumulation of centuries of observing the environment, and it is indeed a rich knowledge. Still, what Yupik observers could not see in the sky was its chemistry. For millions of years, the invisible chemicals in the sky included an important mixture of carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and other gases that absorb energy from the sun and re-radiate that energy to heat our atmosphere, earth, and oceans. Without these greenhouse gases, the entire Earth would be frozen. So we need those to hold in heat, just not too much heat. And there's the problem, is that the burning of fossil fuels, starting with the first industrial coal burning in England in 1751, has put more and more of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so that more and more heat is held in rather than being emitted back to space. So while greenhouse gas warming is happening around the world, the effect is enhanced in the Arctic by changes in reflectivity. Snow and ice, you need to realize, are some of the most reflective natural materials in the world. And as the area of land and sea covered by snow and ice dwindles in the northern hemisphere, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So as the area covered by this reflective surface dwindles in the northern hemisphere, the amount of heat that we're keeping in is increasing and increasing. And so basically what happens is you melt some ice, you reduce reflectivity, therefore you warm up the water more, melt more ice. So you have a positive feedback. And that's positive in the sense that it's a self-perpetuating cycle, not as in it's positive for life on Earth. So as a result of this positive feedback, this albedo effect we say, the Arctic is warming at twice the rate as the planet as a whole. So this change in reflectivity and other effects we refer to as polar amplification, because it's amplifying the warming of the planet. Another example of polar amplification is permafrost thaw. Permafrost thaw is amplifying the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. So you have to understand that a quarter of northern landscapes are underlain by soils that have been frozen for thousands of years. But those soils are now thawing as the climate warms. And as the permafrost thaws, organic matter that was frozen and inert become available for decomposition by bacteria. And that decomposition evolves greenhouse gases. And at our current rates of warming, an additional 150 billion tons of permafrost carbon may be released by the end of the century. So for some perspective, that would be equivalent to about 22 years of greenhouse gas emissions by the United States at our current rates. But we need to put this rapid warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions and amplified by changes in the Arctic, we need to put that in a long-term perspective. Perhaps you have heard that the Earth has been warmer in the past, and therefore that the current warming is part of a natural cycle. The first part of that assertion is correct. The Earth has been warmer. The part about the natural cycle is not correct. To see that, let's look at the past 550 million years of the Earth's temperature. So that horizontal blue zero line will show you temperatures relative to the Earth's temperature over the past few decades. So that line shows you the average temperature in recent decades. So any temperatures above that blue line are warmer than current climate, and temperatures below are colder than the current temperatures. So the scale at the bottom ranges from 550 million years ago on your left there, all the way to the present on the right. So let's see what's happened over this time period. Well, first, notice that the planet indeed has been warmer and colder than today. But let's put that temperature record in the context of life on Earth. So what else was happening on the planet during those warmer and colder periods? Well, it was a lot warmer when fish first evolved over 500 million years ago. Likewise, when land plants first evolved. When the dinosaurs were around, it was a lot warmer. When mammals appeared. But then about 3 million years ago, it started cooling down. And in fact, we went into a period colder than our current Earth is. And we went through about a million-year period of glacial cycles. And during those cycles, polar bears evolved from grizzly bears. And modern humans evolved and first appeared about 200,000 years ago. They finally made it to North America about 15,000 years ago. And only about 10,000 years ago did agriculture and modern civilization come along. So for the entire length of civilization as we know it, the climate was remarkably stable and quite a bit different than it had been before, at least until about 200 years ago with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, when we started putting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So if we want to take a look at this slice of the last 200 years and magnify that to see what's happened in that period, here's what it looks like. We've continued to warm and warm the planet. And now we have entered unprecedented territory. Now human activities are driving the climate. And some suggest that we recognize our impact by referring to a new epoch as the Anthropocene. But where are we headed? What shape will we leave the planet for future generations? Well, how the Anthropocene unfolds depends mainly on what we do in terms of future emissions of greenhouse gases. Again, on here, the zero value on the vertical axis represents the average temperature in recent decades. But now the bottom axis ranges from the year 1900 on the left out to 2100 on the right. So over the rest of this century, whether we slow emissions, that would be the lower blue line there, accelerate them a little, the red line, or accelerate them a lot, the magenta line, climate models forecast that the temperature will increase between 4 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. There's compelling evidence, however, that more than a 3.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature will seriously disrupt ecosystems, agriculture, and coastal communities. Here we go again. If anybody in the room knows what I'm doing here that's causing this to happen, feel free to coach. Oh, moral support, thank you. You saw my flare go off. I told Rachel if I needed help, I'd send a flare up.
Just heard behind me that you should be careful not to press the escape button.
Yeah, I think I'm missing that, but thank you. Okay. I got it. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Nice job, Rachel. Really well done. So I said that there are likely going to be significant disruptions to ecosystems, people, coastal communities, if we exceed this 3.5 degree Fahrenheit threshold. But before we take a look at those disruptions, it'd be good to take a moment to talk about our ability to forecast the future. So climate models are increasingly reliable, and we know that in part because they're quite adept at hindcasting past climates. But modeling the climate, I'll try this over here, let's see if that works. Well, that won't work for what I'm trying to do here. Modeling the climate is relatively straightforward because physics is a pretty well-behaved science. I think Ivan would agree with that. In contrast to physics, other sciences, things don't behave quite as well. So if we're trying to model responses of ecosystems, agriculture, or coastal communities, that depends on physics and it depends on the behavior and the responses of organisms and people, a considerably more complicated set of problems. The first complication is that what happens in faraway places affects ecosystems around the world. Globally, where we grow food, the location of population centers, where the sea meets the land and more, came about in an environment dependent on a frozen Arctic. The Arctic proves to be both an important element in Arctic marine ecosystems and a driver of global climate. By definition, ecosystems comprise communities, then the interaction of communities of organisms and their physical environment. In the Arctic Ocean, the physics that dominate the marine ecosystem center around sea ice. For thousands of years, sea ice formed a barrier to colonization by some organisms and essential habitat for others, including ice algae, plankton, fish, birds, and mammals. When I first studied in the Arctic Ocean, the area covered by sea ice in September averaged 3 million square miles. Since then, September ice has shrunk to nearly half that size. In a region with minimal roads, ports, and other infrastructure, indigenous hunters and industries rely on sea ice as an extension of land. They travel out over the ice to access resources, including marine foods. So in the past few decades, An area of ice twice the size of Alaska has been lost, diminishing essential habitat for algae, plankton, fish, birds, and mammals, and diminishing access for indigenous people to important foods. In terms of the global system, the reduced ice has resulted in a warming signal equivalent to 25% of the warming attributable to greenhouse gases. Moreover, the sea ice decline is outpacing model projections, suggesting that some key process or processes are inadequately understood. But even the most optimistic models forecast a dire future for Arctic sea ice. The models make clear that unless we reduce considerably the burning of fossil fuels, summer sea ice in a few decades will be down to 1/8 of the area it covered when I first studied in the Arctic. An entire ecosystem that depends on sea ice is imperiled. But let's take our consideration of ecosystem change closer to home. Consider California's marine ecosystem. We don't have sea ice, but we can see the influence of physics by comparing near-shore ecosystems on the west coasts of our and other continents. Those ecosystems consistently produce large seasonal blooms of phytoplankton because the longshore winds push surface waters offshore, thereby pulling nutrient-rich waters up toward the surface, where the nutrients and sunlight support the blooms. As the climate continues to warm, we will see stronger alongshore winds and therefore stronger upwelling that may increase nearshore productivity by bringing the nutrients to the surface. But those same stronger winds may also mix the surface waters deep enough that the productive nutrients are pushed below the photic zone, the light zone that the plankton need to grow. It may also be that the greater offshore flow of surface waters will push that production offshore away from the availability to nearshore fishes, birds, and mammals. Well, we know from year to year and decade to decade, there are variations in the winds and currents that influence nearshore temperatures and therefore which fish species predominate. Thus, when our part of the Pacific was in a cool phase in the 1960s, anchovies predominated among forage fish, whereas sardines predominated in the warm phase that peaked around 1990. So what will happen to the fish and other elements of this ecosystem as we impose additional warming on top of these decade-to-decade cycles? As temperature, winds, and currents change, some organisms will be favored and others not. And it is not possible to precisely predict who will be winners and who losers. Some concerns, however, include the possibility of increasing dead zones, such as that seen recently off the coast of Oregon. So these increasing northern winds are bringing up nutrient-rich water, but that water is also low in oxygen. The nutrients promote phytoplankton growth, but decay of those phytoplankton consume even more oxygen. So here again, we can model the physics of the environmental change fairly well, but the complications come when we try to predict biological and social responses. For example, some of the carbon in the atmosphere finds its way into the ocean, turning it more acidic. And that more acidic water interferes with important biological processes with uncertain effects up the food chain. And then there's the challenge of forecasting the fate of an ecosystem challenged by oxygen depletion and acidification and increasing fishing pressure. In agriculture, as with natural ecosystems, there will be winners and losers. Some crops will be better served by warmer temperatures. Others will suffer as water availability, temperatures, and sea level all change. And extreme events may be the greatest challenges, inflicting large losses on crops and stress on livestock. Locally, agriculture already is impacted by sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. This is highly concerning given that agriculture contributes $8 billion a year to the local economy and provides about 20% of the jobs in the county. It's nationally significant because the vast majority of many crops, walnuts, kiwis, plums, celery, garlic, cauliflower, spinach, and carrots, are grown in California. Saltwater intrusion results from the drawdown of groundwater as well as sea level rise, and both those factors are exacerbated by climate change. It's also important to recognize that sea level rise is now being driven by the melt of glaciers and ice sheets. So we return again to Greenland. Since the year 2000, the volume of water annually entering the ocean from melting glaciers and ice sheets has increased by over 500% in Greenland and close to 200% in the Gulf of Alaska. Projections for sea level rise in this century range from less than 3 feet to over 6 feet, depending on emission scenarios and assumptions about how ice sheets will respond. Either way, millions of homes and hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure will be negatively impacted. So this destruction of infrastructure and houses in coastal communities is going to be global. It's already occurring in the Arctic, where coastal erosion has increased to as much as 50 feet per year in some parts of the Arctic. It's taking place in Micronesia. It's taking place in the United States, including California, and Texas, and Florida. The contribution of melting ice sheets impacts, you need to understand, flooding by raising the overall sea level, which then raises the launching pad for deadly storm surges. It's also important to recognize that in contrast to the land-based ice sheets, melting sea ice does not raise sea level directly, but it does contribute indirectly through the amplification effect on atmospheric temperatures. As sea ice diminishes, heat from the Arctic Ocean is able to escape into the Arctic atmosphere. A warmer Arctic atmosphere means a decreased difference in pressure over the mid-latitudes and the Arctic, and that pressure difference is what drives the jet stream. The reduced pressure difference resulting from sea ice loss leads to a slower and wavier jet stream that drives the extreme weather events in the mid-latitudes. Well, let me turn now to a challenge faced by scientists that extends beyond the challenges of understanding the physics of climate change and the impacts on ecosystems, agriculture, erosion, and storms. In fact, it extends beyond the difference between 3 fingers and 2 fingers on my pad, but that's neither here nor there. What I want to address now is the challenge of communicating about climate change. So presentations such as this evening's pose at least a couple of dilemmas. The first is how to concisely cover not just the simple physics, like why we don't fall off the earth, the sort of things my brothers taught me, but rather the complicated interactions of the earth and the sun, interactions of the atmosphere, ocean and ice and land, and interactions of ecosystems and people. The second dilemma is how not to assume the posture of an expert lecturing, but rather of a fellow citizen encouraging empowerment through understanding. So, Mayor Roberson, I come to the story I promised you. Presenting on climate to the students on ICE last month, I took some considerable pains to point out that there are things we can and must do to ameliorate the impacts of climate change, starting with understanding it. Nonetheless, the responses from the students varied widely. One young student from Canada expressed a desire to learn and do more. Of course, she had already, in 8th grade no less, arranged a meeting with her mayor in which she laid out a detailed plan for community greenhouses that would produce all the produce the community needed. I don't know whether you would have been more proud, Mr. Roberson, to be her teacher or her mayor. But another student from New York quietly came up to me after a presentation and confessed to feeling hopeless about climate change. Her demeanor and the tone of voice made clear the depth of her feelings. I was reminded of the hopeless feeling when my brothers told me that I couldn't outrun a missile. Fortunately, being on the ship for a few more weeks afforded the opportunity for longer follow-up, in which I tried, I don't know how successfully, to convince the student that our climate challenge is grave, but not hopeless. One thing that I've learned since contemplating the night sky with my brothers is that we have little chance of solving problems we do not understand. So whether you are a physicist, an ecologist, an engineer, a teacher, a mayor, a fisher, a yoga instructor, a clerk, a salesman, or just students waltzing on 4-billion-year-old outcrops in the tundra, you need to understand what we are facing. With that understanding, you need to assess what can be done and how you can contribute to that solution. Your contribution might be writing to Congress or changing your energy use or something else, but you need to recognize that scientists and political leaders cannot solve the problem without you. Well, indeed, a third student on the expedition waltzed forward and volunteered to help me and my fellow Arctic scientists with a project aimed at making our scientific understanding more readily accessible to policymakers. So with help from Julia and some very talented Middlebury students, my contributions are aimed at helping to inform policy. In a couple of weeks, we'll brief the Arctic and Ocean caucuses of the US Senate and the science ministers of Arctic nations convened by the White House. And nothing could be better practice for that than answering your questions. So let me consult my iPad and note cards to see what your inquiries are. So a student from CSUMB says, relative to the students' campaign to price carbon, I've never found a comprehensive economics global impact study / plan to deal with the negative impacts. As important as a price on carbon is, how viable do you think implementation is on a national / global level? It's an excellent question, and if you don't mind, I'm going to sit it right over here and hold that question for Tom Erb when I introduce him shortly. Thank you for. What is the most proactive way that the public can make a difference for climate change on an individual, on an individual level? Well, I get this question a lot, and everybody has their own favorite answer to it, so I'm just going to give you my favorite answer, which is start by understanding the problem, and then you figure out what you think is your way to contribute. So there isn't a single magic bullet. But I think in order for everybody to play their part, play a role that is suitable to your talents and energies, you need to understand the problem. So I'm going to leave it right there. See what else we have. Okay, here's a question. What is the impact of the US withdrawal? And I'm going to assume that this refers to our withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Well, that remains to be seen. I think the impact won't be insignificant, but on the other hand, the fact that we have the 6th largest economy in the world, i.e. California, saying, no, actually, we are going to stick with the agreements of the accord. And we have mayors showing leadership all around the country making similar statements that I think we're going to maybe not see as negative an impact as if everybody just got lockstep behind this not well thought out decision to pull out of the accord. It also remains to be seen what, the next administration does, for example. You mentioned a 500% increase in runoff in Greenland, but I missed the dates. So that was between the year 2000 and I think about 2015 or 2016, I think about 20. So over a 15-year period, we saw that 500% increase in melt in Greenland, primarily driven by surface melt. There's also concerns, of course, of melt at the edge of tidewater glaciers, but we're seeing these massive surface melts in the summertime, which are really driving that change. Somebody says, it seems as if the media is avoiding the climate change issue. Am I correct in thinking that? Well, I think it depends a lot on what media you read. The New York Times and the Washington Post both do a pretty good job of covering it. Chris Mooney writes a lot on the topic for primarily for the Washington Post. So it's out there. I don't know how it compares to what it ought to be. I mean, I do worry about the strength and vigor of our media these days. It's a hard time to be in the newspaper business as far as I can tell, but we need them more than ever. Also, what effects will the introduction of fresh water from melting ice into the ocean have on the North Atlantic current and other ocean currents? I have a feeling you know the answer to this, but so it turns out that the cold, dense water coming out of the Arctic, sinking in the North Atlantic, is a major energy input into what's called the conveyor belt. It really drives the global circulation of the major currents in the world. And that's important because those currents redistribute heat around the world. And there's evidence that in the past, when that input from the Arctic was slowed down or stopped, that those currents shut down in a major way, which would have just massive repercussions. I mean, one thing you would probably see very quickly is it would start getting very cold in Western Europe because their climate right now is moderated by the Gulf Stream that branches over there. So it's a good example of the fact that both the atmospheric currents and the oceanic currents are redistributing heat. And that's why we get into this goofy argument, do we call it global warming or climate change? Well, it depends what you're talking about. Let me just make one comment about that. So the climate, when we say global warming, in fact, the globe is warming because we have a positive heat balance. We are taking in more heat than we're putting out, right? So the Earth has a fever. But when you have a fever, you can have cold fingers, right? You can have the chills in places because there's not an even distribution of heat through your body, and the Earth system is the same thing. Yeah. How will rising sea levels affect us in Monterey County compared to other regions of the world with lower elevations? Very good question. So there's a lot of people who know a lot more about this than I do, I have to say, but clearly we're going to have some serious coastal erosion problems. We already do. And acidification is a big concern for our marine resources. Will be subject to, as the sea level rises, to storm surge problems. And then there's this whole question of how this all plays out on our agricultural production. There will be winners and losers, as I say. A big issue I think we have to recognize over and over in lots of these climate change impacts, it's really a question of pace. How rapidly does this happen? Because whether it's an organism trying to adapt in an evolutionary sense, or a society trying to adapt economically and otherwise, it matters a lot how quickly the change happens, how readily adaptation can occur. Thank you. It's hard to wake a person who's pretending to be asleep. How do you plan to wake you-know-who up? Well, to be honest, actually, I'm actually going to the White House in a couple of weeks, but I don't expect you-know-who to be at the meeting. But we do have people still working there, even in the White House, who understand that we have serious issues that we have to deal with. There are fewer than there ought to be, but there are some. And so we're kind of focused on working with people who are still awake, whether they be in the administration or increasingly in Congress. And quite frankly, after November, our shift in who we focus our science communications effort has gone much more towards Congress than the administration. It's a lot harder, more unruly audience, but at least, and we're seeing some significant movement among people who haven't traditionally been friendly to these messages. They're actually wanting us to come help them understand what's going on. So, yeah, I don't think it'd be a kind of a long, different conversation. Is he asleep or is it something else? I don't know. You didn't mention the impact that agriculture has and continues to have on the climate as a result of land use change. Hasn't our agricultural impact over the last 10,000 years also impacted our climate since pre-industrial times? Absolutely. It sounds like you could give the lecture, and I hope you will. But yeah, there's a lot of ways that agriculture does this. Certainly clearing land is reducing sequestration of carbon, but we also get significant emissions from things like rice cultivation. That's been going on since very early. And so no, you're absolutely right, and there's lots to be said about that, but so little time. How are we doing on time? Maybe this would be a good time to introduce Tom. So going back to an earlier question, I think hopefully I put it aside. Where did I put this? I promised you I'd come back. So the question had to do with the efficacy of a price on carbon. I'm sorry, I've mislaid the card. But I think it's the case that a compelling case can be made that a fair and effective means of reducing our greenhouse emissions would be to put a price on carbon. And organizations that focus on advocating for a price on carbon include the Citizens Climate League, a sponsor of tonight's event, as well as the student organization, Our Climate. So we'll come back to talking about the Citizens Climate League in a moment, but first I want to introduce Tom Erb, the National Field Organizer for Our Climate. Tom is a senior at Pomona College, where he studies public policy and politics, and he joins us by video conference, and it'll take a moment to beam him up. Bear with us.
Okay, great. How about we give Dr. Kelly another round of applause to start. And also, I just want to thank a bunch of people that made this happen. Again, Dr. Kelly, thank you for your incredible work and your research and your contribution to this cause. Linda and Maribel for making this all happen with someone who's done a lot of event planning. It is extremely stressful. and you guys really hit it out of the park here. So thank you to you. Thank you to the Middlebury Institute, Citizens Climate Lobby, and the City of Monterey for making this all possible. We can do a round of applause there as well. There's a lot of you in there. I can't see you, but can everyone just like say, hey, Tom, or something so I can know how many people are there? Gotta be like 200 people or something. This is unbelievable. And on that note, I think the most important people to thank is all of you. Everyone who showed up today. And if you get into this work, if you get into organizing, you'll understand how difficult it is sometimes just to get people to show up. And all of you are really taking the first step to make this generational movement a real possibility. So I thank all of you. Give yourself a round of applause one more time. It's really interesting because I can see the back of someone's head and that's about it, but we'll go from there. Okay, so I have about 10 minutes here. I'm gonna start with a little carbon pricing one-on-one, and then go into a little bit about the type of work that I've been doing in the Put a Price on It campaign, and then hopefully end on an inspiring note for all of you, and then we can go into questions. I think that's where we'll have the most fruitful discussion. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'll stick around as long as people are willing to ask questions. So really looking forward to that. So what Dr. Kelly outlined here was the problem, right? He outlined the way our world is going to change if we stay on this business as usual path. And while that is extremely intimidating, it is scary, it is sometimes easier to crawl back into our own silos and not try and combat this problem because of the scale of it. The reality of it is that we have the solutions. We have the technology and we have the ability. It's simply creating the generational movement and the will to make it happen. So that's why I'm asking all of you to step up. And I fundamentally believe the one thing we need to do first is put a price on carbon. So while carbon pricing is the only solution, the key, oh, sorry, now I can hear myself. But anyways, so carbon pricing is not the only solution, right? We need to remove subsidies, we need to move towards green tech, we need to for agriculture sector. But putting a price on carbon is a fundamental step we need to take. Keep it simple. Right now you have corporations, industries, putting air pollution, CO2, methane, all these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they're not paying the cost of it in their production, right? So what this does is creates a reality where these costs get passed on to everyone. The climate impact that we're talking about,
Tom?
as on a local level,
Tom?
all these different.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you, when you just speak clearly into your microphone as you kind of move back and forth, we're losing the sound a little bit, so I appreciate you're a person who gestures.
I'm a little animated.
Me
Okay,
too.
let's see if we can visually explain.
But try
more
to speak
clear.
directly into your
Okay,
microphone. Thank you.
So, how's this? Is this better? This is why I love CCL, because everyone is just so happy all the time. Okay. So if it sounds bad again, just start yelling and I'll know there's something. So essentially what we have, right, is emissions, and the cost of emissions aren't taken into account for production. So these costs, the climate costs, the local air pollution costs, the local public health costs, they're getting passed on to all of us, other people, in an externality. So to correct that failure, you need to put a price on carbon. You need to charge polluters for the amount of pollution they put in the atmosphere to internalize those costs. And now this is a great move because not only is it good for the environment, it's good for the climate, it's also a key part of making a more efficient market. It is a conservative idea to make a more efficient market, so this is something that can be pitched on both sides of the aisle. So when you talk about carbon pricing, that is the simple idea. You need to force polluters to pay for their pollution. Now, the next part of that, to keep it simple, is the revenue. So whenever you tax something, you're going to have a lump sum of money that you can then use for something. And that's the source of a number of debates, whether or not to use that for direct dividends, which is something CCL will talk to you all about. You could do a tax swap, you could do investments. That's another discussion, but a key thing to understand when you talk about carbon pricing. And then lastly is the political feasibility of this problem, or of this solution, if you will. Carbon pricing is something that has garnered support from the right, from the left, from the farther left. I don't know about the farther right yet, but we're working on it, and everywhere in between. So this is something that truly everyone can come together upon and start talking and working on a solution to perhaps the biggest issue of their time. So not only is carbon pricing an opportunity to address climate change, it's an opportunity for our politics to actually be more civil again. It's for Republicans and Democrats to actually come together and to work on this. And that's something that why I'm really hopeful. I see this as an opportunity more than a threat at this point in my life. So to take a step back, that's the very basics of carbon pricing. Anyone who knows more about it knows I simplified it a tremendous amount, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A section. But to move along here, a little bit about me. I'm a student at Pomona College. I'm a senior, which is in Claremont, California, not too far away from all of you right now. I'm studying public policy, but why this is relevant is because when I was 15 years old, my father introduced me to climate change. He introduced me to the type of threats that Dr. Kelly just introduced all of you to, and many of you probably already knew. And in that moment, I was extremely afraid because I knew that this was my future. This is what my life is going to be like. And I thought 15 years from now, I may be sitting down my child at the dinner table and have to explain why he or she can see elephants and giraffes and these megafauna in her coloring book, but can't see them across the globe. We'll have to explain why the decisions we made right now or chose not to make is causing mass refugee crises, rising sea levels, more frequent and severe storms. And that's not the future I want. That's not the future I envision. I see a hopeful future, one built on a green economy, and a carbon pricing is a part of that. So that's what's been motivating me now for 6 years. I just turned 21, so that's where I'm at in my life. But for 6 years, that's what I've been trying to do. And the Put a Price on It story started right here at Pomona College, I guess my sophomore year, so 2 years ago. And what we did is we just wanted to work on a solution. We know education is important, we know science is important, but we wanted to get down at the root of this problem, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we started working on carbon pricing. Through the help of CCL and other groups, we realized this was the solution. And what we did on our campus is we went and we talked to not just environmental groups, but social justice groups and economic groups and different professors and groups doing math, because everyone is a part of this, as Dr. Kelly lined out when he said, it doesn't matter if you were a janitor or a senator or anywhere in between, you are a part of this story. So what we tried to do was build a coalition on our campus of people who support carbon pricing. And then we took that all the way up to our college president to get an endorsement of this idea of putting a price on carbon. And that's what we did. Pomona College was the first college to endorse putting a price on carbon. So what we wanted to do was duplicate this across the country. That was always our vision, right? We're not going to be able to do this by ourselves. We need this on a massive scale. Like the person who asked, is this feasible on the federal or international level? The truth is we need it at that level to actually have it make a difference. So what we did next was team up with the nonprofit Our Climate, which was formerly Oregon Climate, and then the documentary series Years of Living Dangerously, and we launched the Put a Price on It campaign. And what we do is we train high school students, college students, grad students, any young people generally, how to advocate locally and talk about carbon pricing, and then actually lobby local, state, and federal officials in favor of this policy. And what started as a dream on a college campus here in Pomona College, a year later, we now have 120 campuses involved across the country. And it's just blown up. It's unbelievable. Yeah, we can clap for that. That's a good reason to clap. If anyone's clapping. So that's the Put a Price on It campaign. It launched August 30th. We now have about 35 colleges who officially endorsed. But more importantly, we have student leaders all across the country who are working on pushing the needle forward on this issue. And the reason why I'm so hopeful, the reason why I see and stand here in front of an administration that is denying science in face of overwhelming threats and challenges is because I've seen the people who are going to lead us into the future. I've had the unique luxury of being able to meet young people across the country who are ready to stand up and solve this problem. And I get to speak to amazing people like you, who wish I could see your faces right now, and I wish I just drove up there, but amazing people like you who are willing to show up and fight the good fight. For example, Sam Blackwood was one of our first students. He goes to Fordham University in New York. He got his campus to endorse. He started an entire campaign, and now he's working with Vice and other groups in New York City to get the word out through the media and to start talking about environmental justice. We have a student in Utah. She was a freshman. Her name was Savannah, and she set out to get a carbon pricing leader on every single campus in the state of Utah. And she made it happen, and now she's moved to Washington, and you can bet she's going to be working on carbon pricing there. And then lastly, I want to talk about Jonathan Liu, who's a senior, I believe, might be a junior at Princeton University. And he is actually the person, his group, who is working, oh, this just got dark in here. 1 second. Stand up. Good thing they do that. That's efficient right there, energy efficiency. So what Jonathan did is he's actually the group who's working with the state assembly member there in New Jersey to introduce a carbon fee and rebate program in the state of New Jersey. He wrote the white paper with high school students on this policy. And that just shows you that even if you're 15 years old, 18 years old, 90 years old, whoever you are, you have a unique ability to bring about change. And that's why I'm hopeful. And where it starts, I'll close here in a second, is you just need to start showing up. And each day you start showing up, you're going to start making a difference, and you're going to see the lives you're changing. And you also need to believe in yourself and need to work together. And my final point, and I think this is probably the most relevant one, is that we could sit here, and Dr. Kelly actually already introduced this idea, which makes me so happy, is that we could sit here and talk about science, which is obviously important. We could sit here and have a wonky policy discussion about carbon pricing, which is important. But the number one way we're going to have a generational movement is through personal storytelling. It's about connecting through our values about why this is important, and this is our future, and we need to build up together. Right? So I challenge each of you to understand what your own personal story is, why you're coming to events like this, why you care, and then start talking to other people. Make this a generational movement. Keep showing up. And that is what's going to push the needle forward. And lastly, I said lastly about 6 times, but I promise this is my last point. Because it is hard. If you start organizing, CCL's been doing this a long time. I'm trying to do this every single day, and it is difficult. It is tiring. There are new challenges every single day. Sometimes you don't even see the results of your work, and it can be really, really, really unencouraging, discouraging, and it can make you fear what the future looks like. What I have to say to that is every single day, there's someone who's counting on you to show up. There's someone out there who believes in your ability to bring about change. And if you don't show up, you're going to let that person down. And why I feel so fulfilled and wake up every single day to keep this fight going is because there's 200 people in this room listening right now who are ready to stand up and fight with me. And we're going to put a price on carbon, and we're going to solve this problem, and it's because of all of you. So thank you very much.
Hi, Tom. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I'm a member of CCL, and so I know whereof you speak. But my question is this. When you talk about putting a price on carbon, that's very clear. I'm wondering if your campaign is neutral about where the revenue goes. And if that's the case, how do you address the problem of helping low-income and middle-income people actually make the transition, which there will be a cost to them and to all of us. So can you address that?
Yes, and what was your name?
Melinda Marin.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. That's a great question. So to put a price on a campaign, we don't have a very specific policy that we advocate for like CCL does, but rather we have policy principles that guide our solution, right? So actually someone just texted me, and this will answer your question as well. One of the first things is it needs to cover all greenhouse gas emissions and not just CO2. Because as we know, if we just put a tax on CO2, that's likely going to make the natural gas industry very much more profitable and not account for methane, which is a serious problem as well. Now, to get back to your question, the other parts of our policy principles is the price needs to be right. It needs to actually be high enough to solve this problem, which is a key part of CCL's steadily rising policy. And then directly relevant to your question is it has to be fair and equitable. It can't disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. And there's a series of debate about how you do that. CCL has an approach that would actually give the dividends directly back to people. And according to economic models, the bottom 2/3, I believe, would actually come out ahead as far as income goes. So that's a solution. We don't have anything against the CCL proposal. We think it is great. We just advocate for more policies other than just fee and dividend, if that makes sense. I can address why that is if we want, but I think for now we might want to move on to another question.
We're going to have people come up at the end and take questions, actually, because we're getting kind of close to the end of our evening here. We want to, think of all of your time. So I think
Great.
we wanted to play a video as our closing, and then both Dr. Kelly and Tom will be available up here at the front at the end.
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. This is documented. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuels and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more competitive. The dividend creates millions of jobs. Carbon emissions go down, reduced air pollution saves tens of thousands of lives, and climate change is brought under control. We can make this happen, but enacting a carbon fee and dividend isn't in our hands, it's in theirs. How do we sway them? What can we do? We can use our voices to express political will and demand action. We must help our elected leaders work together. It's on us to tell them what we want as a group. Because when voices call out together, their impact multiplies. Government can respond to the will of the people, provided we tell the government what we want. And what we want is a livable world. This is what Citizens Climate Lobby works for. To empower citizens to connect with and influence their members of Congress. To spread the idea that each one of us can address climate change. Bring your voice to citizensclimatelobby.org.
Thank you very much for coming. And as Rachel said, Tom and I are happy to chat with people up here. And there are Citizens Climate Lobby people with blue buttons on, and they'll be in the lobby and in the room here as well, and happy to talk to you about their efforts. So thank you very much.